Hey, everybody.
Hello. Good afternoon.
Yes, just barely.
So, we're here for Theology Thursday today, and we'll be talking about the cult of the emperor, but we'll be talking about some other things related to that as well. So, something that you have probably heard us say on a number of different occasions is some variation of the saying, if Jesus is Lord, then Caesar is not. And so today we want to talk a little bit more about what exactly we mean when we say that, why we would say that.
And so, I mean, this is one of those things that, it can be seen as, does that mean that Caesar has no authority? And then we have other scripture that points to the fact that no, earthly authority still has some level of earthly authority. It does answer entirely to godly authority in a different way, and will answer to those actions. But it's not undermining the actual governance authority that exists in the broken world we live in. But instead, it's calling into question our priorities as to where we elevate our understanding of those that are above us. And in the ancient world, it's not often talked about, at least in United States textbooks. But when I was taking my biblical studies classes, they ended up talking about something called the cult of the emperor. I thought I heard it as the secret cult of the emperor.
But no, it was not. It was not secret. It, under a few particular emperors that I'll talk about in a little bit, really gained some traction, and there was an expectation that if you were a good Roman citizen, then you would in fact treat your Caesar as a divine being. And I'll talk a little bit more about that.
But let's look at the religious landscape of first century the Mediterranean. So in general, we have the Jews. That's one group that we know very well in the church because we are grafted into their religious tradition. We are adopted into that tradition, and we believe that Christ is Lord, and Christ was a Jewish Messiah that also opened the door for Gentiles as well. Now, that word Gentile and Jew get used a lot in Scripture. And what do those words mean? Well, a Jew is anyone that is Jewish. Now, today, that can mean someone that is practicing Judaism, but that can also mean someone that's chosen not to practice it, but is ethnically Jewish, that comes from a Jewish family ethnically. And so today there's kind of a greater understanding of what Jewishness is. Back in the first century, pretty much to be Jew was to be of a certain people, and that certain people did practice this faith. And anyone that wasn't of that tradition and didn't practice that faith, which is the vast majority of the world, was considered a Gentile. So Gentile isn't a specific group. Rather, Gentile's a term to say you're not part of this one specific group, which is Judaism. And the Romans actually had a similar phrase as well. You were either a Roman citizen, which was a Roman, or you were considered a barbarian. And that word barbarian actually comes from the history where they were dealing with the Germanic tribes. And they heard their language and they thought they were sitting there going bar, 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 bar. And so they started calling them barbarians. And it stuck. If you were a Roman citizen, you were a citizen and you had certain rights. And if you weren't a citizen, then you were a barbarian. So even back in those days, they had language for the other, for someone who wasn't part of this group. And Romans had their own history of religion as well. And they borrowed heavily from the Greek pantheon.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, I mean, you might remember learning in school, various myths from both from Greco-Roman culture, and you have in Greek tradition the god, or you have Zeus,
and then it was Jupiter
in Roman.
And the only way I remember the Romans is because that's the planet names. So you have Aphrodite, which was Venus. Mm-hmm. You have Mars was actually Mars in both. Mm-hmm. I remember that. Mm-hmm. Oh gosh, who was Mercury? Hermes. That's what it was. Uncle Hermes from Full House. That's how I remember it. Sorry, it takes
whatever works.
Whatever works. Uncle Jesse's middle name was Hermes, and everybody's making fun of him for it. And he kind of was like, "But I'm named after a god."
Yeah.
But yeah, so all of these names, these myths, these stories, one from one culture to the other was kind of taken over.
Yeah, and so in both Greek and Roman culture, however, for a long time, there was always a distinction between the human and the divine.
Nicole said you're welcome. We would always watch Full House growing up, so thanks.
So there you go.
Thanks, kiddo.
So that's how you know mythology. So where was I? So for a long time, there was a clear distinction in the Greco-Roman world between like these divine gods and human beings, even their rulers. Also, I want to remind us that when we're talking about Roman history, there were different periods of the Roman Empire, and so Rome
ebbed and flowed.
It ebbed and flowed, and so there was a time when Rome was known as the Republic, and there was a Senate, and there was power was not quite so concentrated into the hands of one. And
then when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, which is a very serious moment in history, by him doing that, he went from a general out dealing with barbarians to, by him crossing the Rubicon, what he did was in a sense declared martial law and declared himself king of all. And that did not go over well with the vast majority of Romans, which is why Caesar was assassinated.
But from that point on, though, that led Rome in a trajectory where power did become more and more concentrated into the hands of their Caesar, whoever that was. And some of the earlier Caesars, like Augustus Caesar, who followed Julius Caesar.
Yep, right after.
He maintained fairly clear distinctions. Like he was a ruler and he had authority, but he was not divine. And there were several emperors who maintained that kind of boundary, but there were a few who thought a little bit too much of themselves. So we think of emperors like Caligula and Nero and Domitian. Those were three in particular who were pretty intent at elevating themselves to the level of the gods.
And there is a history of this in the Mediterranean, just so you know. The Egyptians also had a pantheon, many, many gods. But along the line, the pharaoh was seen as one of the gods, one of the divine. And so as Rome grew, I have no doubt that there was probably a bit of crossover. And when they came over and heard that this tradition existed in Egypt, they probably go, even more power, even more glory and honor.
Right. Well, and there's not just the Egyptian Empire or the Roman Empire, but when we think about the Seleucid Empire, there's one in particular who I know we've talked about before when we've done Bible studies like in our churches on Daniel, a ruler named Antiochus Epiphanes, who in the book of Daniel, the little horn who's speaking arrogantly in Daniel chapter 7, Antiochus Epiphanes, who elevated himself to the level of godhood. And so this isn't a new or unique thing to Rome, but what developed around, especially around Caligula and Nero and Domitian, was this cult of the emperor, which what was demonstrated through the building of temples dedicated to these Caesars, where offerings would be made and there would be different kinds of ritual and cultic practices. And if you were a good Roman citizen, then you participated in the cult of the emperor. That was what was expected of you as a good citizen.
And if you didn't do this, were you wishing ill on our emperor? Were you hoping that the empire would fall? You're not a good citizen if you're wishing
a terrible Roman
for the empire to fall. And so it started off that you could be Roman and have distinct faith, but then it soon became to be Roman meant that you had to give religious honor to Caesar, and it happened quickly in these eras. And if you didn't do it, then you were seen as someone that was not a good Roman. And as a Christian who's proclaiming Christ as Lord, both Lord of earth and Lord of heaven, Lord of all creation, to name that is to say that Caesar's not, because only one can be. And so there was some serious issues with first century Christians just proclaiming Jesus as Lord.
Yeah. And so this kind of backdrop, this time where there was the cult of the emperor, I mean, that was first century AD. I mean, that was the context in which Jesus arose, in which the Gospels and the letters of Paul were written. This is a prominent backdrop of the book of Revelation. And I want to pull up some pictures. Derek and I had the opportunity 2015, gosh, that was like 5 years ago now, to go to Ephesus, which is in Turkey. But Ephesus was a cultural cosmopolitan hub during the first century. It's in a region that was known at that time as Asia Minor, but as I said, it's modern day Turkey. And when we have the book of Revelation, and there's the beginning where it has the letters to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, those were all to communities in Asia Minor, in modern day Turkey. And Ephesus was one of the ones that was named. And Ephesus was known as a really important city during this time.
It had one of the 8 wonders of the ancient world, which was
was it the library?
No. It's our next slide.
The Artemis of Ephesus.
There we go, Artemis of Ephesus. Yeah, sorry,
we'll come back to that one.
That her temple was so grand; it was one of the 8 wonders of the ancient world.
That's right.
So people would visit. Primarily, that was kind of the tourist stop. Above all else, was her stopping to see that. But the other reason also is they had a medical tradition too.
They did.
And so the ancient world wouldn't do like surgeries and weren't good at like quick medicine. Like if something happened suddenly, like a heart attack or a stroke or something like that, they didn't have answers for that. That was unfortunate. But when it came to long-standing things, like things that were ongoing struggles, they actually had really good answers. Like their doctors were actually solid doctors. And so say you had this nagging ache or pain that's been going on for years and it's not going away. Well, you know what? If you get a chance in your life, get to Ephesus. They might be able to fix the problem. So people would go to Ephesus to visit the Temple of Artemis because it was seen as this amazing pilgrimage site. And I have no doubt to see it would probably be astounding because it was an archaeological or a architectural wonder. But this is to give honor to a god of the pantheon. So as a Christian, that is a struggle. I mean, that's not something that can be done. And so that was the reason they would go. They'd go to see the temple. They'd go for health reasons. And that was enough to pretty much bring people in. And
it was also a port city at that time. It's landlocked today because there's literally like a couple of miles of silt now between Ephesus and the coast of Turkey. And you go to the area was the harbor, and it's just like
you have to like look, and you can see the glisten of water through the valley.
But it's really far away.
But it's a ways off. But the crazy thing is that this silt happened. There was a flood every 500 years. They called it a 500-year flood, and every 500 years it would bring more and more silt and push the harbor back. And so what ended up happening is one of the emperors, and it might have been Domitian,
Possibly.
actually dug out the harbor. It had been pushed back a long distance, like maybe half a mile, and they dug the harbor back out again so it had an economy again. Ephesus was subsidized by the government.
Yep. But anyway, so in Ephesus, which was a place that was a place of worship for Artemis, it also became a place that was very focused around the cultic worship of the Emperor Domitian, who was emperor during the 80s and 90s, which was the time when Revelation was written.
Back when the hair was really big and grunge music was taking off.
Wrong 90s.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, wrong. This is just literally the 90s. And so we have a couple of pictures up here. The picture on the left is the square, the Domitian Square, which is out in front of the area, which we took a picture of on the right, and that is the Temple of Domitian. And there's a lot that is gone today, but I mean, this was a huge structure that was pretty central to Ephesus.
One of the interesting things about Ephesus is if you haven't been to Ephesus yet, and you go now, you're going to see more than what we saw. And if you have to wait another 10 years, you're going to see more than what those that go this year or whenever the virus is over. It's an archaeological site where they're slowly digging more up and then they're rebuilding it. And so these pillars you're seeing on the right-hand side right now, those weren't freestanding, say in the 1900s. But as archaeology was able to dig them out and identify what went where and what was stacked on what, they're slowly being able to rebuild parts of Ephesus, and it's astounding. And so they've been able to rebuild just a little bit of this Temple of Domitian. And I'd be willing to bet Domitian probably saw so many people going to visit Artemis, and he's like, well, by golly, I need some glory.
I am too. On that level. And like I said, many of the emperors did not kind of play themselves up to that level and had kind of more moderate approaches, I guess you could say, to at least their own status. Like, yes, they were to be elevated and revered and they were superior, but it was just a handful of emperors who
divine status,
at least during their own lifetimes. Now, there were some emperors who, after they died, others decided to elevate them to divine status, but during their own lifetimes, it was pretty much Caligula, Nero, and Domitian who were like, yeah, worship me, I'm a god.
One of the things that's fascinating about U.S. history, and I remember this from Dr. Grant Wacker's class, was that when George Washington died, there was a lot of language that, in a sense, elevated him to divinity. And this was common throughout America. It was crazy. This is something we don't think about, especially as 21st century American Christians. But George Washington, by many people, in a sense, was deified. And he did wonderful things. Absolutely. I mean, he was the one that, took charge. He also was given the power of president. And then after 8 years said, I'm done. He walked away, which set a precedent that showed that, this leadership is meant for a time. It's not meant to be a lifetime of rule. He really solid leader in so many ways, wonderful leader as well. And people saw that and they kind of let it run away, their imaginations run away with it. And so there are actually pictures after he died of him kind of being deified, things that call into question Christian theology in a very real way. So we have a little bit of that history as well in America.
We do. But to this landscape in which Christians in the first century lived, they were faced with a choice. And so the cult of the emperor had so developed that it really became a large part of sort of public civic life. I mean, there were festivals and important events and feasts and sacrifices that were regularly made, and as a Roman citizen, you were expected to participate in those things. And the question that really gets posed to first century Christians is, to what extent can they be involved in the imperial cult and still actually be true to their Christian convictions? If you read Revelation, which is a very complicated book to read because of the imagery, because of the type of writing it is,
and because of the theological baggage that we've inherited from the last 200 years.
Yes,
it's and rapture theology is less than 200 years old. Just to name that, it is FYI. Not how the church read Revelation for over 1800 years.
But this is the question that is ultimately fueling the whole book of Revelation. To what extent can Christians participate? And the answer that Revelation comes to is they cannot at all. You might feel as a Christian that you can justify your participation in these things as this is your duty as a good Roman citizen. It ensures your security and your well-being. But the answer that Revelation comes to is actually, nope. You cannot, because when you worship Caesar, even if you don't believe in your heart that it's true, when you do it with your actions, you are in fact denying the reign of Christ. That's the conclusion that John articulates in Revelation. That's what's going on when we have this whole imagery of like the beast from the earth and the beast from the sea. Those are symbols for Rome. You cannot worship Caesar and worship Jesus at the same time.
And every reference to Babylon in all of Revelation is a subtle way of saying Rome, because if the writer of Revelation had even once said Rome, he would have been killed. The book probably would have been destroyed. So this was a subtle way, a secret way of being critical of Rome. And when we're talking about, pardon the language, but it's biblical, the whore of Babylon, they're talking about those that are spending too much energy with this Roman culture that is broken in such a real way. And we as Christians can't do that. Another example from Ephesus that we're going to get to in Acts in a few weeks. More than a few weeks. It's going to take a little while. Yeah. But the book of Acts actually has a story of what happens in Ephesus when the Christian faith continues on. And it calls into question these practices that honor other gods. And there is an economic cost. Because to disrupt the market where they were building idols to other gods, to disrupt that market and to disrupt the market, I believe it was the woman that was telling the future possessed by a demonic force. To interrupt those things meant that you're literally stopping the livelihood of people that are invested in these unethical and ungodly things.
Yes.
And when they get angry, they have a real reason to get angry. They're not just a bad guy. They're literally going from having an income to no income at all. So it's actually understandable why they're furious. And it goes to show that there is a cost in saying Jesus is Lord, which we talked about in Bible study, that this cost is said by Bonhoeffer to follow Christ is to
when Christ calls a man, he calls him he bids him come and die.
Yep.
So we see this really played out in the first century of the church existence in the Roman Empire. And this is related, but I don't know if you've heard about some of the accusations that early Christians faced from those who were not Christian. So one accusation was that they were cannibals. Cannibals. What? Why
This
were
is my
Christians
body,
cannibals?
and this
Yes.
is my blood.
That sounds really peculiar and strange to those who are outside of the practice and don't understand Holy Communion, who don't understand the Lord's table. They're like, wait, what? You're eating bodies and blood? Like, y'all Christians are weird. You're cannibals. That was an accusation that was hurled against them. Another one was that they were incestuous because they referred to one another as like brother and sister. They talked about
that one. Wow.
like family of God kind of stuff. Like, we're a part of the family of God, so we are brothers and sisters in Christ. I don't think that one was quite as common as like the charge that they're cannibals. And then the last one, which is particularly pertinent to our conversation today, is they were called atheists. The early Christians were accused of being atheists. How can that be, you might ask?
Well, the reason that that's the case is because if you don't follow the pantheon, if you don't have a place to say, well, yeah, like they're okay in a sense with saying that Jesus is God, but Jesus is one of the many. Like, toss him on the laundry list. And that's okay, but you have to still give honor to all the other gods on the laundry list.
Right. Well, if you're denying, for instance, if you're denying the pantheon of gods, if you're denying the emperor is divine, like, then you're a godless pagan. I mean, that was
not even, technically not a pagan, because that's what they were.
I know, but I mean, I'm using that term because
you're a godless crazy person.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
And just so you know, the word pagan, the reason I even had hesitance of that is that to be a pagan, talking about that insider outsider language, like if you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile. If you're not a Roman, you're a barbarian. If you're not a Christian, you're a pagan. With one exception, and that exemption is Judaism. Yep. So as a Christian, when we use the term pagan, what we're actually saying is anyone that follows a faith that is not ours or a faith that is not Judaism. Yeah,
and the only reason I use that phrase is because that is a phrase that, you might hear Christians.
Yep, absolutely.
Like, godless pagan, which is.
Yeah, but it's one of those words back in the first century have such different meaning.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So all the Romans from Christian perspectives were pagans, and all the Christians probably were seen as barbarians.
Yes. Yes.
So this you crazy barbarian might have been the better.
Yeah. Or the early Christians were seen as threats. Well, and here's where early Christians got into trouble, because of their proclaiming Jesus as Lord and their unwillingness to participate in these civic and cultic acts around the Roman pantheon or the emperor. They were seen as being disruptive to the order of society. Like, they were disruptive to the institutions. They were in a sense seen as a threat, and maybe not like a strong threat, but they were a nuisance. They were not, they needed to be squashed before they caused greater problems. And we see in the first century, while we don't see any kind of wide systemic empire-wide persecution, we see points where it flares up, and in locales there are pretty intense persecutions, like when Nero is emperor and part of Rome burns, he blames the Christians for it, and he's known for then proceeding to use Christians as torches to light
I had
the
wondered
streets of the city.
Which one it was.
Yeah, so that's something that's attributed to Nero. And then there are other moments in history in the first century or two where the emperors have really like cracked down on the small groups of Christians. But at this time, the churches were really small communities, and they were pretty not secret communities, but they were not.
There was no public space that was Christian.
There was no public space.
It was a house church movement. taking place. The communities of faith would probably meet in several locations. And I wouldn't say it was like super, super secret.
Right.
But at the same time, by it not being public, that in a sense is
Mhm.
secret. It's not like a secret society, but it is kind of one of those. They knew that if they were too public about it, that there would be
Mhm.
serious cost, even cost to the point of death.
Yeah. And so I want to pull up a slide again. When we were in Ephesus, we were walking down the street, and we had hired our own personal guide, and Derek saw this
Little
thing
circle.
that I'm circling right now, and was like, what is this? And we were very glad that our guide like stopped, and he
pulled
us,
up a stick.
He pulled
and
up
started
a stick.
teaching in the sand. It was awesome.
It was. He started drawing in the sand with a stick and showing us. So he drew the circle, and he said, "This is actually an alternative Jesus fish. You know, the ichthus, which was a symbol for Jesus. And the reason it was a symbol for Jesus is because the letters that spell out the word ichthus, which is the Greek word for fish, were oh my gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? An acronym for Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. And that's so, as our guide told us, this symbol contains all of those letters. So I'm going to show you if you can see where my mouse is going. So the iota is what starts it. And that's this
just
part,
the upright
it looks like an eye.
Line. Yep.
And then the next letter is a key, which looks like an X, and it's the like CH when we see ichthus. So we have the key there. And then we have the theta, which is the TH sound. And that's the circle, and then the line
that's
across.
A whole circle with a line in the
middle.
middle.
It's like an O with a line across. And then we have the upsilon, which looks kind of like a Y in the uppercase, but it's like the U kind of upsilon sound. And then we have the sigma.
This is the toughest one to see because we don't have an equivalent letter.
Yeah.
It kind of looks like backwards number 3.
Yeah, or a little bit like an E, but it's the S sound, the sigma.
So it goes on the curve on the top, and then it cuts it into 45-degree angle, and it goes back at the opposite angle, and then it's the curve on the bottom.
And so in this little circle that looks just kind of like a wheel or a pizza pie or something.
Oh, we know that shape very well in this house, because anytime we ask Gus what he wants to eat, it's always
pizza.
And he does say it like that. It's amazing.
And so, our guide proceeded to show us how this symbol was at that time kind of a still like secret code.
A subtle
way of letting other Christians know that there are Christians here, that there are Christians present. And I found that to be totally fascinating.
And I remember growing up, my dad would always talk about how Christians would just kind of kick a circle in the sand, and then the other, if they were an actual Christian, so they'd kick a half circle in the sand. And if the other person were a Christian as well, they'd be facing this person, and they'd kick the opposite, which ended up being
the Jesus fish.
And that was a secret way. Little did I know that. I mean, there was another etching that our guide described. It was the foot of a woman.
Oh yeah.
It was the left foot of a woman, which what that meant was
up on the left there was a brothel.
Yep. And so the fact that
all kinds of secret like
and
etchings and codes.
The fact that it was a port, he was saying, sailors, that stereotype is an old stereotype. Not saying that it fits in all cases, but that's one of the reasons why that existed there. And so he had shown this foot, and we had walked past. I think I'd seen another one of those circles before, and I'm like, well, what on earth's this? And he was not even going to mention it. And then I'm really thankful we ended up talking about it, and he just went to that great explanation. I'm like, that is awesome. Like, the Jesus fish is amazing, but I love that's the alternative. This circle, this kind of cartwheel in a sense, is just as rich theologically, and in some ways even more rich, because it covers that the greater meaning of ichthus, which is, what does it stand for again, the acronym?
Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. Jesu Christu, Weos, or Weos, Theos, Weos, Soter. Yeah, sorry. I can't spell out loud in my head. I need to see things written. I need to see things written down.
No Greek at all. So I'm just like, sure.
Yeah.
But it's awesome. I mean, and that's a subtle way just to say that, hey, we're here. You might have to ask around. And Paul did spend some time there. Got in trouble there, got arrested there. But I mean, this place is a key place in early Christian history, but it's also this place where the emperor is expecting not only you to bend the knee to the emperor, but to also pay, to give an offering, which is like double tax, by the way. I mean, that's hilarious. It's like, not only are you getting taxed, you're now giving your religious money. Wow.
Yeah. And so, we live in a different time than ancient Rome. We do not have an emperor who declares himself divine.
We've got 3 branches of government that the forefathers were very careful about giving checks and balances. And that is absolutely awesome.
But the question that early Christians wrestled with, to what extent do they participate in, adhere to the powers that be? To what extent can they do that and still proclaim Jesus as Lord? That is the question. And that question is one that still exists for us today, even though we do live in different times. We absolutely live in a different time and space. But the reality of proclaiming Jesus as Lord is no different. If Jesus is Lord, then what or who is not? That's a question that we still have to wrestle with today. And there may be times where our allegiance to Jesus is greater than any other allegiance and that we might be asked to have.
That can come with social cost. That can come with financial cost at times. That can come with loss of rights. And Stephen Prince talked about sometimes being arrested still puts us in good company.
Absolutely.
There are times where Christians, to do what they are called to do by God, which is love God above all else and love your neighbor as yourself, and to live like a servant as Christ embodied over and over and over. There are times where we're called to serve and could end up breaking the law because of that, because there's an unethical, immoral law on the books, and to show the love of God is actually against the law. I know people have been arrested for feeding the homeless. I know people have been arrested for putting water out in the desert for those that could literally die of thirst. There are people that are loving their neighbor that are being arrested, and it's because they are doing what God has asked. Now, the crazy thing is, yes, there are, I'll name it. I've visited prisons before and juvenile detention facilities. There are hardened criminals, and they are scary as all get out. But there are also people that are finding faith in God that is absolutely astounding. And just last year, I had the honor of attending a graduation where Appalachian Bible College had offered a full bachelor's to all those that wanted and applied for and had to have a certain level of acting properly and are you willing to do the work at Mount Olive Prison. And after a long, arduous process of learning, they eventually learned their degree, their bachelor's, and they had worked so hard. And to be there and to celebrate on that day, I can honestly say that was good company. Those were men who had made serious bad choices, and they'll admit this. but had found a faith that was real and it was life transforming. And they were lights in that prison. They brought light and hope. So much so that I know of at least one that was moved to another facility to hopefully start sharing that light, sharing that hope in a new environment. And so, yeah, sometimes being arrested actually puts you in good company. And that's sometimes in a very real case that is true.
Yep, absolutely. So, we ourselves have to wrestle with these questions, the same questions that the early Christians wrestled with, even though we are in a different context.
Absolutely.
But the reality of proclaiming Jesus as Lord has not changed. And what does it mean to give him all of our allegiance? What is the cost of doing so? And that's something that we all wrestle with.
And in order to know this context, we have to study history. And so today's Theology Thursday might have been a bit more history than you're used to, but history gives us context, and context helps us understand why things and why beliefs at a certain period, how they translate to the period we're in. So we hope that this helped translate it for you a little bit, helped you to understand that though times are different, that there is still a lot that is the same. And this is just one of those things that we're passionate about, and we hope that you're excited about it as well. If this is something that meant something to you greatly this day, I just urge you, again, like it, share it. If it's something that you know someone else might benefit from this, share it over Messenger. Give them a personal message and say this might be something you'd like. We're doing this as a means of trying to reach out in this time of isolation, and we just want to provide a blessing. So if this would bless someone, please, by all means, share the blessing.
Yep. So thanks for joining us today, and we will hopefully see many of you all on Sunday morning for worship.
10:30 a.m. We'll be having a blessing for mothers, as well as a blessing for protection for those that are providing the greatest help, and also for our masks.
Yeah, so if you have masks that you're wearing when you're out and about doing your grocery shopping and things like that, bring those for worship on Sunday morning, virtually, of course.
Yes.
And we'll be offering a blessing of protection. So we hope that we'll see you there, and for all of the other things that we have throughout the week. So we'll see y'all next time.
See ya.
Bye.